This tofu scramble is really my favorite, and that's because I really like to put the kitchen sink of whatever vegetables are left in my fridge into this type of dish. And I think it makes it pretty versatile too. It's great. You can adjust the seasoning a little bit, make it a taco filling. You could really, put it on top of a hearty salad or a Buddha bowl, like I mentioned in a prior session. So one of the things that I look for when I'm counseling people on making healthy changes to their diet is, look at the things about a food that you really like. So is it the texture? Is it the smell? Is it the flavor? Is it that it's, a hearty protein to have with breakfast that's kind of stick to your ribs? Whatever it is that someone is trying to have in their meal, it's really important to listen to that and then think of things that could, meet those needs, not necessarily that exact food. And so the plain old tofu scramble that we did the water saute with in a prior video is a good example of that. This, you could just as easily use the same water saute technique, but I'll use the oil saute technique in this one just for variety. Again, I'm going to use a non-stick pan. Encourage you to do that anytime you're working with tofu. It's just an ingredient that really likes to stick. And even when you use, gobs and gobs of oil, you're still gonna have sticking. So using a non-stick pan really helps you reduce the overall amount of oil that you need, including to zero if you use the water saute, and you can just really not have so much frustration in the kitchen because you're not constantly scraping the bottom of the pan. So I'm preheating my pan. I'm just gonna put about a tablespoon of oil for the whole dish, maybe not even quite, maybe a couple teaspoons. One thing I counsel patients on when they're trying to figure out how to reduce calories in the diet is just use whatever amount of oil you need to get the cooking outcome that you desire, and don't use any more. Liquid oils at room temperature are heart healthy. They're really fine to have, but they are a really concentrated source of calories, so about 100 calories a tablespoon. So each little bit you add is a pretty big calorie bump. So, okay, we're going to go ahead and saute our veggies. And what we want to do is get down to medium-low heat. Add whatever vegetables you have, really, anything that's looking like it's about to be past its prime, just chop it up, small dice, and toss it in. If you add your vegetables and it feels the pan's a little hot, which might be a little bit hot, you can always just pull it off for a second, stir it around, turn the heat down. There's lots of ways to reduce the heat when you're cooking. And then in a minute, when these vegetables have cooked down, I'm using some red pepper. In the recipe that you'll see online, it shows green pepper. Bell peppers are really interchangeable, and honestly, sometimes I'll make this with cauliflower, broccoli, mushrooms, kale, you name it. Sometimes it's as much vegetables as tofu, other times it's just a little bit because that's what I have. This is not a finicky baking recipe. You can take a lot of liberties. Also the spices, so in the tofu scramble that's meant to replace eggs recipe where there's not a lot of additions, then the ingredients added are really meant to replicate a little bit the flavor of eggs. It's certainly not, something that you're gonna pass in a blind taste test, but it's a good, hearty, rich breakfast option. Here you can just pick whatever the flavors are that you want. So, especially if you like salt-free seasonings, you can get an Italian type one. You can get more of a, Spanish sort of flavor, Latin flavors. Here I'm going to season it with a little bit of cumin. That I just really like cumin in just about everything. A little garlic powder. You could also use fresh minced up garlic. I like to keep lots of variations of garlic around. I really like garlic, whether it's frozen and pre-pressed or it's minced up. Dry garlic, anything that you're adding garlic powder to that has a lot of moisture, it'll give it a nice quick garlic flavor without that need to cook or worrying about burning it. So it's nice for beginner cooks too, because it's taking one thing away that's tends to be a pitfall for people cooking. I'm going to add some paprika or cayenne. If you're doing cayenne, use a little. If you don't like spicy, if you're using paprika, you can use more. Fresh chilies are great in this too. If you like spice, by all means add some fresh chilies. And then, let's see, I'll go ahead and add some grated carrots now. Carrots tend to be more of a strong flavor, so if you don't want a big chunk of carrots in there, then I'll grate them up like this. You can also grate up other vegetables, so if you're trying to I don't recommend sneaking vegetables into people's diets that don't like them, but if there's a texture that's really problematic for people, sometimes grating them up can, you know, remove that different texture that people don't like. So just giving you a few different options here. So what I'm aiming for here is to get the onions so they're starting to become translucent. So I know we've gone over that idea in other sessions. I refer you back to the saute class for that. But in general, you just want it to go from that white opaque color to being, like you could imagine it becoming see-through if it kept on cooking. You just want it to be soft, so it's not a real crisp, harsh bite of onion. You want it to be more of a mellow, sweeter flavor. And I added my bell peppers and onions together at the same time because they're chopped up the same size and they take about the same amount of time to cook. The grated carrot is, you know, basically as soon as it's warm, it's soft and it's just going to blend into whatever we make, so we can add that later. That's something if you forget, you could even add it really close to the end, it would be fine. And since the onions are getting close to being done, but they're not quite, then I would add in any other seasonings I hadn't yet added. So for the turmeric, you can add it either now or you can add it with the eggs. I tend to not like to get a lot of heat on the turmeric because it can give it a bitter flavor, so I am going to reserve the turmeric for a minute until I get to the tofu. And yeah, I don't think I'm going to add any other seasonings. Fresh herbs are really good in here. If you're going to use dried herbs, you'd add them when you're adding the onions and the peppers. If you're going to add fresh, you'd add it toward the very end. You just want to kind of release those oils and the fresh herbs, but not cook them a lot because you'll start to lose the flavor as it sits. I think we're pretty close with these onions. I'm starting to smell like a nice caramelized smell. I don't like to get lots of browning on this, but if you're someone who really likes like a strong, roasty, umami sort of flavor, you could add more brownness to this, maybe crank up the heat a little bit. If you like more of a mellow flavor, then don't let it brown. Then I crumbled up the tofu earlier, but I didn't press it. And I'm using a regular tofu, not a silken tofu. Silken tofu does not work well for this. I'm going to add that turmeric, as I mentioned. The goal here is not really to add a lot of flavor, but just to add a nice yellow color so it looks a little bit more like egg. I'm going to add the few other ingredients that I have as well. So I have some nutritional yeast, which is a good source of B12, especially if you're having a lot of plant-based meals or you're, you know, entirely plant-based in terms of your diet. There's not very many good sources of B12, but nutritional yeast is one of them. And then I'm going to add a little low-sodium soy sauce or tamari. Use tamari if you're gluten-free so that you don't get that wheat. There's always a little bit of wheat in soy sauce, even though it's called soy sauce. And then the last ingredient I'll add is I have just about a teaspoon of agave syrup here. You can add any kind of sweetener. The goal is just to add a little smidge of additional carbohydrate to enhance the browning of the tofu, which otherwise wouldn't brown very well. And that gives it a richer, more like meaty umami flavor that is totally worth that little extra teaspoon in a whole bunch of servings of added sweetener. So now I'm just stirring it around, trying to mix things up so it's got a uniform color. Another important thing about this recipe is that a lot of liquid is released from the vegetables, so those onions and peppers I added early on. If you have some liquid in the pan, you want to make sure to cook all of that off before you add the tofu. Just keep making sure that the liquid is gone. Otherwise, you know, if you have a lot of liquid in the pan, this will just stew and stew and stew. Also, if you're using too small of a pan, and so there's a, you know, it's a thicker layer than what I have here, it can really, you know, you could cook it all day and you might not be able to brown it. So you could always do 2 batches if you have a small pan. So once this is all, you know, a pretty nice yellow, even yellow color from the turmeric, I might crank up the heat a little bit just to get a little caramelization. I like just a little browning on the tofu. If you tend to be someone who, when you eat scrambled eggs, likes them, you know, almost still runny or real soft, then you probably don't want to go that far in cooking. If someone that likes them more well done, then you might want a little more browning. And certainly this by no means will taste exactly like scrambled eggs, but it's a really nice, like, healthful protein option for the morning or really any time of the day. Just starting to get a little bit of browning. We're almost there. And if you want to see if there's browning instead of stirring it, you can kind of scoop some up and flip it over and see if you're getting a little bit of brown bits there, and that's where we are. So I think I can go ahead and turn it off. And we'll get a nice dish or plate or container to transfer this to. This is one of those recipes that it will keep for several days in the fridge. It actually freezes really well. So you know, tofu, when you still have a lot of the liquid in it, when you freeze it, the liquid tends to become totally separate, and the proteins stay together, it becomes spongy. But since we've cooked out a lot of the liquid, especially if this is in a mixed dish, it works really well in the freezer. So this is ready to go, you know, by itself with some toast for, you know, a good egg replacement for breakfast, or as a filling, or as a topping on a salad or a bowl.